this tutorial I just want to have a very quick chat about transitions. When to use transitions, what they are and why. Now transitions happen all the time when you cut video. So when you go between one bit of video and to the next, you've got a transition. It's happening, that's called a cut. It's just cutting straight from one thing to another. It's not gently transitioning, it's immediately or instantly transitioning. And in video, generally that's what you're going to be doing most of the time. You're going to be having a cut from one thing to another. But just occasionally things jar as they go from one thing to another. So going from this sandy beach to this close fade water might look a bit odd. It's a bit of a jump. It doesn't really follow logically, and so therefore you might want to put a transition in to be able to ease the eye, to ease your viewer from one clip to the next. Now, there are different types of transitions, and most of them we like to keep invisible. And what I mean by that is, of course the viewer can see them, but they give a message that the viewer understands, so that they don't really notice the transition, they just understand the message that it brings. For instance, if you dip to black, it might mean that time is passing by. Whereas if you have what's called a cross dissolve, where you dissolve from one clip into another clip, what you seem to be saying is at the same time in another place. So different types of transitions can give different meanings to your work. So we tend to try and not use transitions as much as possible and use them when we absolutely have to for a general scene or a general timeline. You might have, for instance, a dissolve at the beginning and a dip to black at the end, so that it comes up from black and it goes down to black, giving a smooth start and a smooth finish. And you might decide that one or two of your cuts are so strong that they do need some sort of transition between them, as this one clearly does here. So you can add transitions in as you feel you need to in the timeline. However, try and use them as limited as you can get away with. Now, the other thing to say is that there are weird and wacky transitions, and they do actually have their role. There are times when you want to move your storytelling on with a transition that says we're going somewhere else, we're looking at something completely different. We're trying to give a message that we're moving from one scene to another. A classic example of that is in Star Wars, where George Lucas would have some sort of wipe going right across the screen very obviously, which said to people, we're now going from one side of the galaxy to another side of the galaxy. We're moving on in our story, or this is the end of one chapter and the beginning of another chapter. So when it comes to transitions, most of what you'll be doing will be just simple cuts, just cutting from one thing to another. Others will be a fade from black or to black, which is saying we're starting something new or time is going by. Another one might be a cross dissolve, in other words we're carrying on the story but a slightly different location. Or we might be using a wipe, or we might be using something that's quite dramatic, a blur, a fade, a zoom, that's saying, right, now this is another part of the story, or we finished that chapter, we're starting another chapter. So when it comes to applying transitions, try and use them as little as you can get away with, because you don't really want them to be obvious, unless you're making a very obvious statement that you want your audience to follow. Because video is all about your audience, and you want your audience to follow your storytelling. Okay, so now I've given you a bit of a background as to what transitions are. Let's look in the next tutorial about applying various transitions and what happens if there's not enough head or tail footage.